Everything seemed perfect from the outside, and I really do mean perfect in the most aggravating way possible, because we had the big house with the wraparound porch and the stone fireplace and the kind of backyard that made you want to take up grilling even if you were terrible at it like I was, and we took the vacations to tropical islands where the sand stuck to your sunscreen in all the wrong places but you still smiled for the camera because the view was just that beautiful, and we had the smiles on Instagram, those wide polished ones that screamed couple goals with hashtags and likes to prove it all, except behind closed doors something felt off, and it had been that way for a while, though I couldn't tell you when exactly it started because it crept in slow like a leak behind drywall until one day you just woke up to mold you never knew was there. She started working late more often, which on its own wasn't suspicious because her job was demanding and her boss was the kind of man who thought deadlines were more important than dinner, and I told myself that's just how careers go sometimes. But then there were the texts, the ones that made her laugh to herself when she thought I wasn't looking, and the way she tilted her phone just slightly away like her screen had become a secret she didn't want to share, and even that might have passed as harmless if not for the sudden shift in how she looked at me, not the way she used to, not with that spark that made me feel like I'd built something solid, but with this new glaze like I was a fixture in the background, something she forgot to dust off but still expected to work. I ignored the signs because love makes you stupid and stubborn and weirdly optimistic even when it shouldn't, and I told myself that this was just a phase, maybe she was stressed or tired or just in a rut, and I didn't want to be that guy, the suspicious husband who imagined things that weren't there, so I kept my mouth shut and poured her wine at dinner and kissed her on the forehead like everything was normal even though my gut was telling me it wasn't. And then came the day I came home early, the kind of early that isn't planned, the kind that happens when your afternoon meeting gets canceled and you think maybe you'll surprise her with lunch or flowers or something spontaneous like you used to do back when things still felt light and good. I walked through the door and the first thing I noticed was silence, not the peaceful kind but the tense kind, the kind that crackles just beneath the surface, and the second thing I noticed was the smell, a scent that didn't belong to either of us, cologne that wasn't mine or any brand I'd ever seen in our bathroom, and then I heard movement upstairs, soft and rushed and unmistakably not alone, and I stood there with my keys still in my hand, frozen like some cliché in a soap opera, not knowing whether to charge up those stairs or walk back out and pretend none of it happened. But I went up, and what I saw when I opened that bedroom door shattered everything. Not just the image of us or the trust I'd held onto like an idiot, but the entire framework of my life, because betrayal doesn't just cut deep, it rearranges your whole reality. And standing there in the doorway, I realized I didn't even recognize the woman I had shared a bed with for nearly a decade. This isn't just a story about betrayal, though. This is a story about revenge, rebuilding, and rising higher than ever before. Because what came next turned everything around in a way that'll leave you speechless. Now, when I say everything shattered, I mean it in the most complete way you can imagine, not in the way a glass falls and cracks into a few manageable pieces, but in the way a windshield explodes when something heavy slams into it from the wrong angle, leaving behind nothing but a mess too sharp to touch. And standing there in the doorway, I saw the truth, not the whispered hints or quiet suspicions, but the full Technicolor version of it, with all the shadows gone, and there she was wearing nothing that belonged to me, and next to someone who clearly had no plans to hide or apologize or even look surprised like he had done this before and had every reason to believe he'd do it again. They both froze when they saw me, and for a second none of us moved, like we were waiting for someone to yell cut and tell us this was all part of some bad TV pilot, and I stood there in that awful quiet that happens right after a bomb drops, where everything feels like it should be louder but somehow isn't. And then she did something that made my stomach turn more than the cheating itself. She reached for the blanket, not out of modesty, not out of guilt, but with this strange mechanical calm, like she was annoyed to be interrupted, not embarrassed and not sorry. And when she finally spoke, her voice was ice wrapped in velvet, asking, "What are you doing home so early?" like I was the one out of place in my own house. I don't remember what I said next because it doesn't really matter. Nothing you say in moments like that sounds like it should. Nothing lands right and nothing fixes anything, so I just turned around, walked back down those stairs and sat on the porch because I couldn't breathe inside that house anymore. And it's strange how quiet the world stays even when yours is falling apart, because the birds still chirped and the neighbor's sprinkler still clicked in its regular rhythm, and somewhere down the block someone was playing guitar badly, and all I could think about was how normal everything outside was while my life was in free fall. She came down a few minutes later, fully dressed, makeup still smeared in a way that made her look almost human again, and she sat across from me on the other side of the porch like we were strangers waiting for a bus. And when she finally spoke, her words were cold and deliberate, not angry, not pleading, just clinical, like she was filing paperwork. She said, "I think this means it's over." And I said, "Yeah, I think it does." And that was it. No screaming, no tears, just two people sitting beside the ruins of what used to be love, trying not to make eye contact in case it made everything more real. That night I didn't sleep, I didn't drink either, because I wanted to feel everything. I wanted to sit with the betrayal until it stopped stinging, or at least dulled enough to move. And sometime around 4 in the morning I started packing, not in a rush, not in anger, just slow, methodical, grabbing shirts and socks, and that framed photo from the Grand Canyon where we looked so happy I couldn't even recognize myself in it anymore. And by the time the sun came up, I had everything I needed in the back of my truck, and a strange kind of peace had settled over me, not the kind that comes from healing, but the kind that comes from knowing the worst is behind you, and now all that's left is what you decide to do next. This wasn't going to end in tears or begging or a dramatic showdown in a courtroom. This was going to end on my terms, and if she thought she'd seen the last of me, she had no idea what was coming next. Because this isn't just a story about betrayal. This is the part where the storm starts to shift and I start building something stronger out of everything she tried to break. They say rock bottom has a basement, and I found that basement somewhere between the second night sleeping on my buddy Rick's old pull-out couch and the morning I found a photo of the two of them tucked into a book I had given her for our anniversary. And it wasn't the photo itself that bothered me, though seeing his arm draped around her like he belonged there did give me the kind of heartburn that no antacid could touch. It was the fact that she used my gift to hide it, like some twisted trophy. And that's when the part of me that had spent years ignoring little red flags finally stood up and started screaming. It's funny what you notice once you stop pretending everything is fine. The subtle changes in tone. The receipts that don't quite add up. The passwords she stopped sharing once her phone became a fortress. And suddenly all those late-night meetings and weekend retreats weren't about team building. They were about tear down. About dismantling a marriage piece by piece, while smiling through holiday dinners and sharing inside jokes at barbecues. And it made me feel like I had been the punchline the whole time. So I stopped sulking and started planning. Not revenge exactly. Not yet. But awareness. Sharp. Focused. Brutal awareness. And I went back through our shared calendar. Through credit card statements and email confirmations. Through every breadcrumb she'd left scattered behind her. Thinking I was too busy. Or too trusting, or too tired to follow. And what I found painted a picture that was ugly and obvious. A pattern of deception wrapped in routines I thought were sacred. And when I say it lit a fire under me, I mean it burned away the last bit of sympathy I had left. For the woman who once swore she'd never hurt me, I started small. I needed control over something. So I took back the garage code, changed the Netflix password, and called the bank to split our joint account. Not because I needed the money, but because I needed her to feel the shift, the tremor before the quake. And the next time I saw her, she was polite, distant, almost cheerful, like she thought I'd just fade out, like background noise she no longer needed. And I smiled, because she had no idea that the version of me she cheated on was gone, and something stronger had taken its place. Then I went to the gym. And not the kind with smoothies and soft towels. I'm talking about the kind of place where the walls smell like sweat, and the regulars have names like Tank and Razor, and they teach you things with your knuckles that most people only learn in nightmares. And I told them I wasn't here to lose weight or make friends. I was here to stop being prey. And they nodded, like they'd heard it before. And I punched that heavy bag until my shoulders screamed, and my legs buckled. And when I left, I felt like I'd shed something that didn't belong to me anymore. I made a list next, not of what she took, but of what she left behind. My pride, my patience, my belief in forever. And I decided that if she was going to rewrite our history, then I was going to rewrite my future. And it wasn't going to be a sad story about a man who got cheated on and faded into nothing. It was going to be a story about a man who took the hit, stayed standing, and came back swinging. Because this isn't just a story about betrayal. This is a story about what happens when you stop crying and start building armor. And the first nail goes in with your bare hands. There's something liberating about hitting the bottom of your life and realizing there's nothing left to lose. Because once the worst has already happened, everything else just starts to feel like noise. And that's exactly what I felt the morning I decided to stop being quiet about what she'd done. Not loud in the way of shouting or threats, but loud in the way a man becomes when he stops pretending and starts telling the truth without flinching. And that truth was simple. She had wrecked what we built, and she thought I'd walk away quietly, like a tenant evicted from his own home. But I wasn't a tenant. I was the foundation, so I started crafting my message. Not to her, not at first, but to the people who had been watching from the sidelines, with their arms crossed and their mouths shut, the ones who smiled at our Christmas parties, and liked our anniversary posts, and thought we were the couple who had it all. Because I knew once the mask came off, she'd try to paint herself as the victim, and I couldn't let that happen, not without a fight. So I wrote it all down, every lie, every receipt, every late night she spent at meetings that ended at motels with bad lighting. And I didn't post it, or mail it, or even read it aloud. I just kept it tucked in a folder labeled future. And knowing it was there gave me the kind of peace I hadn't felt in months. And just when I thought I'd made peace with the wreckage that used to be my life, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. No words, just a photo of the two of them at a restaurant she told me she hated. The kind of place where they serve appetizers on slates and water in jars. And I stared at that photo, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed something I'd suspected all along. She hadn't just moved on. She'd been somewhere else entirely for a while, and I'd been holding on to a ghost. I showed the photo to Rick, who had been letting me sleep on his couch, and he whistled low and said the words that hit me harder than I expected. Man, she really didn't think you'd do anything about this. And he was right. She didn't. She thought I'd crawl away into my quiet corner and nurse my wounds like a good man should. And that's when I realized I wasn't just rebuilding. I was evolving. And nothing scares a betrayer more than the one they betrayed. Rising up without rage, but with purpose. That night I stood in front of the mirror in Rick's bathroom, the kind with bad lighting and toothpaste splatters. And I looked at myself like a stranger, trying to understand who this man was and what he wanted. And I saw someone different, not broken, not bitter, just sharper, clearer, forged by fire. And when I stepped away from the mirror, I left behind the version of me that used to hope she'd come back. Because now I hoped she'd watch what I became and regret everything she threw away. Because this isn't just a story about betrayal. This is a story about reflection, about facing yourself in the mirror, and not just recognizing who you are, but deciding who you're going to be next. Reinvention is a funny thing, because people think it starts with a haircut, or a new wardrobe, or maybe a fancy gym membership. But real reinvention starts in silence, in the still hours of the morning, when you're wide awake with nothing left to lose, and too much truth to ignore. And that was exactly where I found myself, sitting alone in Rick's garage, with a notebook, and a beer, and a list of everything I was going to change. Not to win her back, not to prove a point, but because I finally realized I'd been living like a background character in my own life. And that just wasn't going to cut it anymore. So I started making moves. Not big flashy ones, but deliberate ones. The kind you don't see coming until they're already halfway done. I called the bank and had our auto-pay accounts separated. I rerouted the streaming services to my own email. I even took back the second car. Not because I needed it, but because she didn't deserve to coast around town in something I paid for, while pretending she was single, and free, and independent. And with every click, every form, every decision, I felt something come back into my chest. Like control, like strength, like breath. Then I went deeper. I made an appointment with a lawyer, the kind of lawyer who wears plain suits, and gives straight answers, and doesn't blink when you hand him a folder labeled marital fraud. And I slid it across the table, and watched his eyebrows lift, and his fingers tap just once on the desk, before he looked at me and said, "This is a strong case." And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had leverage, not because I wanted revenge, but because I needed closure. On my terms, not hers. Meanwhile, she was still playing the role of the misunderstood woman, walking around town like she was grieving a marriage that ended without warning, telling our mutual friends that I changed, that I became distant, and bitter, and cold. But the truth was, she'd been writing the ending long before I ever knew we were even in the final chapter. And I wasn't bitter. I was rebuilding. And that's the part they were about to see. The part she hadn't counted on. I started working out harder. Not to punish myself, but to prepare. Because healing isn't just about moving on. It's about building a version of yourself that can't be broken the same way again. And I kept my schedule full. Took on extra hours. Fixed the old truck in Rick's driveway. Started volunteering at the local shelter. Anything to keep my hands busy. And my mind sharp. And every time I walked past a mirror, I saw less of the man who'd been cheated on. And more of the man who was going to outgrow all of it. She must have sensed the change. Because one day she texted me. Just 2 words. We need to talk. And I stared at the screen. And felt absolutely nothing. No anger. No panic. No hope. Just curiosity. Like a man watching a rerun he's already memorized. And I didn't answer. Not right away. Because I knew the minute she realized I was doing just fine without her, the game would change. And sure enough, 2 days later, she showed up outside Rick's house, standing next to her car, in those heels she always wore when she wanted to look confident, and a face that couldn't decide if it was sorry or scared. But I didn't go outside. I let her stand there for a while, let her wait, let her wonder, let her realize the man she used to control wasn't home anymore. And when she finally drove away, I smiled. Not because she left, but because I didn't chase her. And that's when I knew the shift was complete. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was rising. Because this isn't just a story about betrayal. This is a story about standing your ground. Long enough for the storm to pass. And realizing you're still standing. They say when it rains, pours. But no one ever tells you what to do when the rain stops. And the air just hangs heavy, with all the things left unsaid and unresolved. And that's the space I was living in, when she finally decided to do more than text, and more than show up uninvited. When she came knocking, not just on my door, but on the edges of my new life, with that look in her eyes that wasn't quite regret, and wasn't quite hope, but something more dangerous, uncertainty, and a plan she hadn't quite figured out how to deliver. I opened the door, not because I wanted to hear her out, but because I was curious, like a man watching the final scene of a movie he already knows the ending to, but wants to see how the actors play it. And she stood there in a coat she used to wear on our date nights, back when we still made reservations, and smiled without showing teeth, like she was auditioning for forgiveness. And I gave her nothing, but the space between us, and the sound of my own breath. She started with small talk, like nothing had happened, like we were old friends reconnecting over coffee, instead of exes separated by betrayal. And I let her speak, because sometimes silence is louder than a shout. And she eventually got to the point, which wasn't really a point, but a question. Do you ever think about what went wrong? And I said sure. I think about it all the time, especially when I'm building something real and honest. With people who don't lie to my face. That should have ended it. But it didn't, because she had something else up her sleeve. And she pulled it out like a magician, desperate for one last trick. She said she wanted to make things right. Not with me, not exactly, but with herself. She'd been going to therapy, she said, and she realized how much she'd hurt people. And she didn't want to be that person anymore. And I almost believed her. Until she said the one thing that gave her away. She said I still think about what we had, and how maybe we gave up too easily. And that's when I knew it wasn't about healing. It was about rewriting the narrative, about spinning the story, until she came out looking brave instead of selfish. And I told her no, we didn't give up easily. I held on until my hands bled, and you let go without warning. And that's not giving up. That's being left behind. And I won't let you frame it any other way. She looked at me like she didn't recognize the man standing in front of her. And to be fair, she didn't, because the man she cheated on wouldn't have said that. The man she lied to wouldn't have stood there, so calm, so steady, so clear. And that silence between us stretched again, and she nodded like she understood. But her eyes betrayed something else, something sharp and unsettled. And just before she turned to leave, she dropped the curveball. She said, "I'm pregnant." And the silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was deafening, because I didn't know whether to laugh, or scream, or walk away and never look back. And she didn't say it was mine, and I didn't ask, because we both knew the math didn't add up. And yet she stood there, waiting to see if I'd flinch, if I'd fold, if I'd soften. And I didn't. I said congratulations, and closed the door, not because I was cold, but because I was finally warm enough without her. Because this isn't just a story about betrayal. This is a story about knowing when someone's storm is no longer your responsibility to weather. There's a moment in every man's life where he stops being reactive and starts being intentional, where he no longer waits to see what the world throws at him, but instead steps forward and throws something back. And that moment came for me not with a bang, not with a scream, but with a quiet sunrise and a coffee that tasted like resolve and a realization that I didn't owe her anything, not answers, not apologies, and definitely not another piece of myself. I spent the next few weeks doing the kind of work most people skip because it doesn't come with applause or instant results. I showed up to the job I used to just tolerate and gave it everything like it was a stepping stone instead of a dead end. I helped Rick fix up that old barn we'd always talked about turning into something better, and I started planning a side project, something with my hands, something that belonged to me, something she could never touch or claim or twist into a story about us. Meanwhile, she kept popping up, not physically but in texts and mutual friends and casual mentions that reeked of manipulation. She wanted people to know she was struggling and I was thriving, and she didn't like the optics of that, not one bit. So she started twisting things, saying I changed, saying I pushed her away, saying I wasn't the man she married. And for once I agreed, I wasn't the man she married, I was the man I should have been all along, and that scared her more than anything. Then came the court date, the final step in a process that had started the moment I saw her with someone else, and I walked into that courtroom not as a victim but as a man who knew his worth. And when the judge asked if the marriage was irretrievably broken, I didn't flinch. I said yes and meant it. And when the papers were signed and the gavel hit the bench, I felt something leave my body like a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. She tried to talk to me after, said she didn't think it would actually go through, said maybe we were just in a rough patch, and I said rough patches don't last 6 months and involve hotel receipts and burner phones. And she said she didn't recognize the man I'd become, and I said good, because I built him without you, and that was the last time we spoke, not because I was bitter but because I was finally full. It's been months now since that door closed, and every day I wake up a little more free, not because she's gone but because I'm no longer waiting for someone to love me the way I deserved. I've built something with my own 2 hands, and it's not flashy or perfect, but it's mine. And every time I walk into that little workshop or shake the dust off my boots or laugh with people who actually see me, I remember what it felt like to be invisible, and I make sure no one else feels that way around me. Because this wasn't just a story about betrayal. It was a story about finding out what you're made of when everything falls apart, and realizing the best revenge isn't destruction. It's becoming someone they never saw coming.